Yes, thank you,
Okay,
James.
no, thank you for that, Nathan, and thanks everybody for coming today. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people, the traditional custodians of the land in which I am today, and pay my respects to elders past and present. And I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that may be listening today. My name is James Martin, and I'm with the Insect Plant Interactions Lab at La Trobe University. I'm currently undertaking a master's by research under Dr. Martin Steinbauer. And today I'm going to talk to you about some of the work I've been doing, looking at how infestations of the giant pine scale in Australia are supporting increased foraging by European wasps and honeybees. And the thing I'm really going to be sort of focusing on is the honeydew that the giant pine scale produces, and the two main foragers that we detected visiting that honeydew, Vespula germanica and Apis mellifera. Honeydew is a powerful carbohydrate resource, which I'm sure everyone here is well aware of, as I'm sure you are aware of the tendency for social insects such as ants, bees, and wasps to form strong mutualisms with the insects that produce that honeydew. From the literature, we know that the formation of these mutualisms is often associated with a colony level change in behavior, as often the colony will expend time and energy defending the resource from competitors, and that defending that resource, the producer of that resource, from the natural enemies. Or simply as a result of having access to a high quality resource, more time can be dedicated to meeting the other needs of the colony, be it collecting nest material, protein, or brood management. And not all social insects forage for the same resources, and certainly not in the same manner, and that especially holds true for wasps and bees. Honeybees are really well known for their recruitment signaling, most famously the waggle dance that individuals will do upon returning to the hive after finding an area of high value resources, and this aids recruitment to that resource for other individuals in the colony. Bees rely quite heavily on visual cues to locate resources within the environment, such as colour, reflectance, and absorbance. This is particularly important in their ability in finding flower resources in the form of nectar and pollen, which are the main food for the honeybee colonies. Comparatively, wasps are not known to have any nest-based behavioral signaling in the same way that bees do, although there has been shown that in some Vespula germanica colonies, naive wasps can detect and memorize scents, particularly the scents for carbohydrate sources, on successful returning foragers, which helps those individuals then recognize carbohydrate resources when they begin foraging. This ability to recognize and utilize high value carbohydrate resources in the environment then increases the success rate as the wasps are hunting for prey, which is the primary protein source for the wasp colony. In this particular instance, the source of honeydew comes from Marchalina hellenica, the giant pine scale. It's a soft-bodied scale insect which falls in the Cocomorpha infraorder. It originates from the Eastern Mediterranean regions, so Greece and Turkey, where it contributes to around 60 to 65% of the pine honey that's produced in that region, which equates to around 15 to 20,000 tonnes per year. It was first detected in Australia in 2014 on a novel host for that species, Pinus radiata, and it's currently restricted to a small area of southeastern Melbourne. However, Victoria does have some large areas of commercial radiata pine plantations, which represent some large swathes of potential habitat if it does manage to escape the current infestation area. We conducted our study at Cardinia Reservoir. The reservoir was constructed in between 1970 and 1973, during which time they used radiata pine plantings in a number of areas to prevent erosion and to stabilize the soil. We chose two of these areas, one site infested with giant pine scale and one without the giant pine scale. And within each site, we chose 5 trees to monitor for the duration of our study, which ran from the end of March to the start of June. So the last 2 months of autumn and right up until the very start of winter. To monitor these trees, we utilized some pretty cool camera technology. They're called eyes on hives. These cameras were designed to monitor beehives, and setting these up to monitor small areas of the trunks of our pine trees allowed us to evaluate the visitation and foraging frequencies of those visitors to the giant pine scale honeydew at an observation intensity well above any of the other methods I could find in the literature, because they usually involve physically going out and observing a tree for a short period of time on a sort of semi-regular basis. We also assess scale density at the end of our monitoring period. We did it at the end because the process is quite destructive for the scales. Choosing 5 sort of 10 centimeter sections of bark crevice right in front of where the cameras were monitoring, we stripped all the waxy flocculant that was covering the scales and directly counted the number of scales in each of those 10 centimeter sections and used this to get an average for each of our trees. From our camera, we captured a whole heap of 30-second video clips as they were triggered. And of all of the videos we captured, 184 caught visitors, which I was able to make a positive ID on. All the videos which contain visitors to our trees were captured in our infested site. And as you can see here, there are absolutely no videos caught any visitors to our trees in the uninfested site, which gives a very strong indication that the presence of giant pine scale and the honeydew it's producing is really the thing driving the foraging of the bees and wasps at these trees. And looking at the 2 species within the infested site, you can see that honeybees in blue here and European wasp in red, that we were around twice as likely to observe a visitor as being a European wasp compared to honeybees. And that was confirmed in the numbers, with 66% of visitors being wasps and 34% being bees. We also used those numbers to estimate the visitation rate of each species to the little area of tree trunk that we were monitoring. We did this with the numbers based on the number of hours that our cameras were active during the whole study period. Wanting to further look into the activity within our infested site, we looked at any difference in visitation between trees. We were able to show that there was little variation seen in the visitation of honeybees between trees, which you can see here in the blue again, and they're all around the 0.04. However, European wasps in red really did appear to show a preference for some infested trees over others, especially tree 3 compared to trees 2 and 4. And yeah, once again, confirming that honeybees really didn't show any preference between trees. It's just as long as there was pine scale and honeydew, they visited trees in a relatively equal number. This shows that the wasps are foraging unevenly in space within our site, but the honeybees weren't. So next we looked at any temporal variation that we might have seen. Looking at the average visitation rate across the 5 infested trees for each week, we were able to show that there certainly appears to be a peak in visitation around the middle period of our study. We're also able to show that for both species, there is strong evidence that the visitation rate isn't even across the period, and that the peaks that we're seeing are true to the behavior that's changing across the season. And you can see here that around early to mid-April, the visitation really ramps up to the start of May, which then tails off right up until the start of winter and the cooler months. Looking at this trend, I also was wondering whether this peak associated with any changes in the availability of honeydew. So using some preliminary phenology data, which is currently being collected as part of an ongoing PhD by a colleague of mine, Duncan, as you can see, our study began during the 2nd instar stage of the giant pine scale. And just prior to the increase that we see here, the population of giant pine scale began their molt from the 2nd instar into the 3rd instar. The 3rd instar is known to produce the largest amount of honeydew per individual, approximately 10 times the volume of honeydew per scale compared to the 2nd instar. Although further to this, it is possible that the low levels of activity which we saw in the first few weeks here are also going to be due to the pre-molt period, when the scales are known they stop feeding and hence stop producing honeydew as they prepare for the actual molting process. Looking at resource availability again, we wanted to have a look at see if some of the variation we saw within our site was due to the variation in the scale density of a given tree. Here you can see, once again in blue across the middle here, there really doesn't appear to be any discernible relationship between the visitation rate and foraging behavior of honeybees and the density of scales on the area of trees which we were monitoring. There does appear to be a weak positive correlation, however, between the visitation rates of European wasps and the density of scales, though it is important to note that this particular regression was used with the calculated visitation rates to each tree over the entire course of the study. So it does suffer somewhat from having only 5 data points. And as such, the regression was found not to be significant. But based on the other results that we did attain, I would probably suggest that this trend would hold true and prove to be the case given more monitoring if we were able to. So from these data, we can see that European wasps appear to be better at capitalizing on this new honeydew resource being presented by the invasion of giant pine scale. And from what we know about the foraging requirements of wasps, primarily needing carbohydrate and to locate prey, we can expect that wasps are probably going to be able to find both of these resources within the pine forest where the honeydew is available. And if they can fulfill both of these requirements in the same area, then these radiata forests, which are often thought of as being quite barren or green deserts, they suddenly start looking like pretty ideal areas for these invasive wasps to take up residence. It also appears that Vespula germanica's strong use of olfactory cues when foraging for carbohydrate is allowing them to more efficiently forage for honeydew within the pine forest by spending less time on trees where honeydew availability is lower and more time capitalizing on trees with higher crop yields of the honeydew. Conversely, bees don't seem to be able to capitalize on honeydew, giant pine scale honeydew to the same degree that the wasps are. This is likely due to the pine forests only representing a source for one of the major foraging requirements that they have, just the carbohydrate. Bees very much require pollen to feed the rest of the colony. And one thing we know about radiata pine forests is there's a distinct lack of understory. So any sources of pollen or floral resources in these areas are going to be very few and far between. And because of this, bees are going to need to split up their time between fueling up on honeydew and carbohydrate and then leaving the pine forest area that's infested by the pine scale and heading out into other habitats where flowers and pollen resources are going to be far more plentiful and available. So in terms of who's likely to be the dominant forager in these areas sort of moving into the future, I think our data makes a fairly good case that Vespula germanica is going to be the big winner when it comes to increasing infestations and the spread of giant pine scale and the honeydew it produces throughout Australia. I'd just like to very much thank my supervisor, Dr. Martin Steinbauer, and Duncan Jaroslow, who's a PhD student I've been working with, and the rest of our lab, and thank you very much.
All right, thanks very much, James. Some nice results there. Got time for a couple of questions for James. All you honeybee people and wasp people, don't be shy. All right, quick one. So are you claiming that, so the honeybees obviously can smell the honeydew because they don't go to the trees without the
Yes,
scale.
so they are recruiting to the infested sites, and they are making use of the honeydew.
Yep.
But they're not able to discern and as effectively utilize the resource as the wasps are. They're certainly benefiting from it, but not to the same degree that I would expect wasps are.
Okay. Yeah, because you're saying in the native range, honeybees are really good at exploiting.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's partially because it's very industrial. They move, the beekeepers move, I think it's in excess of 225 beehives per square kilometer into these heavily infested giant pine scale forests, specifically to pump out all of this pine honey, because
I see.
They were a big fan of pine honey or honeydew honey. And it's quite a large market over there.
Okay, but these were feral bees. I might have missed
Yeah,
that. Yeah,
yeah, very much so.
gotcha. All right, nice work, James. Let's move on to the next.